So before we start, so we have all that in place. And Scott's in Canada about to give a keynote on the hour at 12 noon, is it, for Canadian time? So we're kind of on the clock for this one as it happens today. And Naomi has put a lot of effort into preparing this, so we want to make sure that we give her as many people as we can before we get going. Unfortunately, there have been a few conflicts that people have come by in the last minute, but this will also be available on the website. So when we will be the recording. I cut out all this messing when we go to the recording for the website. We'll edit. We give it a minute to get to 5 past and then we'll get started.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So we'll do that. But it's been interesting to hear about the Icebox Challenge.
Yeah, I'm super interested in that. We have a vision also to have a student-led process here. So we're really happy to have a conversation about that, about what worked and what didn't work, and funding as part of that, community,
Definitely.
public art as part of that, and retrofit as part of that. That in my mind, that's a cool extension of that project, which I haven't seen done, which is to retrofit the the to code box.
Yeah, it was just so hopeful, like seeing the code box perform better, than before. So, and Richard was there too, Richard Yancey. And remember, New York City had done one in 2018, and that was before the latest revision. And we saw a difference in performance even from the 2018.
That's cool.
Yeah, right, Richard? That was amazing. Yeah.
Okay, everybody, we're going to run out of time if we don't get started. So if you don't mind, I'm going to welcome you all to our third BAC Learning webinar. And our topic today is rural retrofit. Before we get to that, though, we have a little bit of housekeeping. We ask everyone to put your mic on mute and keep your camera on if your bandwidth allows, please, because if we can see people, it's so much nicer when we can't be together. Naomi Beale will give a presentation followed by a conversation with our very own Scott Foster. As I said, this is being recorded and will be available on our website as soon as we can get it up afterwards. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat during the presentation, or raise your hand during the Q&A, and hopefully time will allow us to get to all of those questions. Really, why is the subject of rural retrofit important? It's a global issue. Almost 1/3 in Ireland, almost 1/3 of Irish people live in the open countryside or rural areas. That's 17.8% in the US, 17% in the UK, and globally it was 43% in 2021, although it is expected to fall to about 1/3 by 2050. In the rural areas, we don't have the urban infrastructure. We have to travel to work, to school, to doctor's appointments, sports and recreational activities, for shopping. You need to have access to a vehicle if you live in the open countryside. Unemployment rates for women in the EU, for example, are higher in rural areas than in urban areas and cities. Distance from urban infrastructure such as health, education, employment, grids, transport have a direct impact on employment and on earnings. And rural residents aren't just employed in forestry, horticulture, or farming. Many who live in the countryside were born there and they prefer to live in the countryside. It's a lifestyle choice. Others just could not afford to live in an urban area. They may get a site free, a piece of land free, or for very little cost from a family member, and then be able to build on it. So it allows them to have a home of their own. I know electricity here in Ireland is charged at a higher rate in rural areas than in urban areas because it costs more to deliver to a rural area. But then our electricity grid isn't robust enough, and nor is it robust enough anywhere throughout the globe to provide sufficient electricity for the existing number of homes, let alone the number of homes that are going to be built over the next 20, 30 years. Supply is often interrupted, and whether that's due to weather or breakages or outages or just where they're upgrading, we often have interruptions in the rural areas. From a health point of view, drafty homes, because they're older housing stock, they're heated by fossil fuels, especially open fires, and they contribute to health issues. And that includes, they exacerbate chronic conditions such as asthma and COPD. Children are missing school, parents are missing work to look after the children, and this has an economic impact on families. Dispersed housing in rural areas, it's not a simple solution. There isn't going to be a simple solution for houses to provide heating for homes, for water, to provide water for cooking. District heating, for example, isn't an option when you're in the dispersed rural living places. Families are dependent on fossil fuels. They're dependent on oil, gas, and electricity, whether it's clean and green, or whether it's provided from gas. That's what they're dependent on. And fuel poverty is a major economic issue in rural areas, the same as it is in towns and villages and urban areas and cities. For example, if you can remember back to Tomás O'Leary's presentation last month, he showed us a training centre in the Midlands in Ireland. That has been funded through a Just Transition programme in Ireland, because the Irish government has put an end to peat harvesting in the Midlands because of the impact on the environment. But the impact of stopping the peat harvesting has had an economic impact, because there are jobs. That's an implication for jobs. And it also has an implication for those who were allowed to gather their own for their own family use, to be able to harvest the peat. So it's contributing hugely to fuel poverty and to general poverty if those jobs are not replaced. It's the social and economic issues, implications are huge. And I suppose post-pandemic, people are actually choosing to live in the countryside because they have a lifestyle that they can have, as long as they can have access to broadband. So we're not seeing a shrinking global population in the rural areas to the extent that we thought we might. It's going to continue to stay a little bit more stable than we had expected, I do believe. So I'm going to ask Naomi Beale from Passive House Maine. She's going to tell us about why her organisation is doing what it does and why it's achieving the success that it is doing in this area of rural retrofit. Naomi is the Executive Director and founding member of Passive House Maine. She's also a founding member of the North American Passive House Network. She has developed Passive House Maine into a sustainable organisation through local, national and international partnerships. And she believes economic development can be fostered through a framework of building efficiency and using innovative and traditional wood products. Naomi, I'm going to hand it over to you, let you in here now, and you can do your presentation. So if we ask everyone, your mic's on mute, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara Ann. It's great to do the presentation. You did such a nice job setting up the, the reality. I feel like you could have been talking about Maine directly, and I know that you were generalizing globally about the challenges of urban housing and lifestyle. So let me I'll start by sharing my slides. So Passive House Maine, just a little bit about Passive House Maine. We're about 10 years old. We just had our 10th annual Winter Forum, which is a full state conference, which brings together everybody who's interested in building science, geeking out that way. But a lot of our attendees are relatively small builders working on single family projects. We have a lot of commercial projects, but the professionals who want the support are often sort of smaller companies. Through pandemic, we had a couple of rocky years, but in terms of actual events, but the organization itself has stayed pretty strong. We have a great board. We have a great advisory board. I started as a board member, chair of the board, and moved into the executive director position about 5 years ago. And I've been really grateful to have hired our training director. We have a number of subcontractors that sort of keep us going, and we're constantly on the lookout for another round of funds, another program to keep our efforts most effective. We definitely, like, I could hire 5 people and use them gratefully right now if I had the funds, which I don't. So perpetually on the lookout for that. The history of Passive House in Maine and maybe is different than other places, or reflective of the states in which all of the original houses were small, because they're basically people of means who had some flexibility and wanted to build their piece of paradise on the water or in the woods in Maine. And as a result, we have a lot of expertise built up in single family homes. And gradually, we have managed to also build up similar expertise in multifamilies and larger commercial buildings. And about 5 years ago, even I guess when I started as the executive director, I was like, all right, it seems like we're getting some, I've been using the word fluency lately, fluency in new construction. And the real challenge when we are looking at the buildings in Maine are the existing buildings. And retrofitting of those existing buildings is just, we call it a tough nut to crack. Every building is a snowflake, as they say. So in Maine, we have about 500,000 units. We have the oldest population in the country. We have the oldest housing stock in the country. And as Barbara Ann also mentioned, in Maine anyway, we burn a lot of number 2 heating oil. We don't have great natural gas infrastructure across our expansive wooded state. We have a lot of number 2 heating oil and backup with wood or total wood furnaces, which, as Barbara Ann mentioned, are really have impact on the people's health. We also have pretty extreme weather, and it goes from extreme cold. We had 0 degrees with a minus 39 Fahrenheit wind chill here this past winter. And then increasingly, we have pretty crazy humidity and heat, more than we used to have even 10 years ago. Side note, this is my house pictured here. It's my stack of wood that we, chopped down in our woods, split on the edge of our woods and moved to our house. We had, at that point, you can see 2 wood furnaces firing in those 2 chimneys. We've since replaced the big furnace with heat pumps. So we have a backup wood furnace, or sort of classic Maine building right there. Let me just make sure we're moving along here. So yeah, just as a record of how old Maine's buildings are, this is how it pans out. And like the house that you just saw is a classic colonial cape, 1776. But there's a lot of in between. They're most all wood, most all underbuilt, and will still be around in 2045 when we're trying to reach our carbon goals. So Retrofit Maine began with a vision of a project in Millinocket, and that map right there shows Millinocket way up. Maine is a pretty big state, 98% wooded, and Millinocket is about 4 hours drive from where I am, just north of Portland. And this looks like a regular neighborhood, but it's like, not joking, that's Main Street. So we, after the closing of the mill, which is shown there at the top of the road there, about 15 years ago, they lost a huge amount of their population and had about 17% vacancy in the whole very small town. And so the vision was that we would renovate 50 houses. The original project was called 50 houses. We'd renovate them, and then create some kind of microgrid and really proof of concept with this relatively cheap building stock, and sort of do it up. And we ran into exactly the problems that are reflected in that rural energy gap, which was well documented in a study in Maine by the Island Institute. But just as Barbara Ann mentioned, once you get out of urban centers, you have a lack of skilled workers, a lack of materials, a lack of money, and the whole like management of getting even one house done up in Millinocket 5 years ago was prohibitive. We just couldn't do it. We couldn't, the houses were worth so little that by the time we'd invested a sort of passive house level retrofit to it, they would have been like ridiculously out of whack with the rest of the building stock and no market to sort of cover the costs. So that was phase one, our concept of doing this study in Maine on retrofits in Maine, sort of smaller rural buildings. And in reality, we weren't not able to do the project that we had in mind for all of the barriers that exist for any individual trying to do their retrofit. So we had a second iteration where we had these three, there's one image missing here, but we had 3 projects that we were sort of sponsoring, not with real funds, with gestural funds, but they were basically reflected the typologies of Maine buildings. This is a classic triple decker, that's workforce housing in many mill towns in New England. The classic farmhouse on the far left there. And the third was a ranch in a sort of suburban neighborhood. And I mean, all of Maine's suburban neighborhoods are essentially rural. So these are 3 building types that were the right type and projects that were ready to roll. The farmhouse is part of a bigger school that was built on passive house new buildings, and they wanted to retrofit. The triple decker is owned by a collaborative in a very poor neighborhood in a mill town in central Maine. And then the ranch was owned by a professor at Bowdoin College who's wanted to do a good job in his renovation. And in the end, so we were like, all right, we're ready. We offered funds for pre and post monitoring to sort of demonstrate the value of the retrofit. And the pandemic hit. These are the projects that got dropped. You know, that the school built their new dormitories and their new student center, but the renovation of the farmhouse didn't happen. The the working, it's not even working class, it was a very poor neighborhood in Lewiston, Maine. That building did not it just got dropped. It was just too complicated, not an option. People, pandemic complicated everything. And similarly with the other project. So that the third model of what was going to be our demonstration projects also didn't work because we were reliant on other people's projects, other people's money. We were trying to track these projects that other people would do because we didn't have the money to fund them. So that also didn't work. And then the third iteration right now, what we're leaning into for the moment is gathering general data from retrofits that meet our standard, which is all electric and ventilated, with tons of assumptions about what's gone into the envelope to justify an all electric and fully ventilated approach. We have on that website, there is a collection of 5 projects worth of data. We want to increase that. We're saying to 20 by next year, and really make the website valuable not just to professionals but to consumers and homeowners. I field a lot of questions. I have this house. What can I do to make it passive house? And so having the website be a real source of information is what we're leaning into right now for Retrofit Maine. To complement that, we also have this whole series of trainings, which we were given funding from the Governor's Energy Office to provide across the state. Our application said that we're meet people where they are out in the woods. And, to be clear, that's everywhere in Maine. But Portland is in the very lower corner of Maine. That's where most of our programming is, because that's where most of the people are. But we said, okay, for these builder trainings, we have a new building code that we're trying to implement. We have required builder door tests, and we have a ton of existing building stock that's just getting barraged by extreme weather events, and people who live in those houses are literally suffering. So let's meet people where they are in their residence. So we have completed a bunch of trainings out and about in all of Maine. This is really important work to educate local builders, local code enforcement officers, local lumber yards, local town planners offices on what's available for both new construction and existing buildings, approaches for existing buildings. We're just kicking off a new training that is specific to retrofits to answer the questions that we field regularly about how do you approach a sort of underfunded and under insulated building. So the trainings are a really important part of what we're doing right now. And along with those trainings, I've been thinking about this concept, which is this culture of efficiency, and how can we have Mainers really embrace efficiency. We have a traditional economy that's based in forest products. As I said, we're just mostly forests. So we've had paper mills and lumber yards, lumber mills forever. The center image there is of East Millinocket. We've lost 10 mills in as many years in Maine, and that's just it's a devastation to those communities. And the question is, how can we replace those economies in a way that really benefit the immediate communities, as well as the whole state, as well as, let's say the Northeast. And the far right image there, that is the mill in Madison, Maine, which was recently bought and renovated by Timber HP, which is a fiberboard insulation company that has developed a product very much like the Styco and Gutex product. And that is, it's just so wonderful. They just had their first wood chip delivery today. They just posted it. That's a byproduct of the lumber industry, which traditionally was made into paper and now is being made into insulation. And the question for me in terms of culture of efficiency, I mean, to be able to say to our builders in our trainings, use this product, it's a Maine product. It's the Maine forest product. It's supporting traditional Maine industry. It's so much more powerful than telling those same builders to say, to use Gutex, which is a German, it's this exact same product, but it's German. It has a weird name, weird words on the side of the print of the product. Sorry. and is shipped and is expensive, shipped across the ocean and is expensive. So I'm like, how can we just like own it? Like, how can we take this insulation industry, the sense of baking in self-sufficiency, independence, security into our individual buildings. And I just toss up here, Mainers are known for, kind of this ingenuity, so proud of being completely uncomfortable You know, in Maine, we try to, it's always a contest, like, have you turned on your heat yet? You know, and if you can go till Thanksgiving, then that's like some kind of, there's like a pride associated with suffering. But it feels like there's a moment here where we can really own our ingenuity and our frugality and morph that into really sturdy buildings, taking a workforce in the construction industry that is known for its Wild West approach. You know, you ask a couple of your buddies over to put a slap on in addition to your house so you can have an extra bedroom. It's typical, and it's has bad results for the building, bad results for communities that then need to supplement heating for those communities, and bad results for individuals living in them. So we have, I guess I just wanted to sort of contrast some parts of Maine that have really embraced efficiency and embraced new construction with a view to the future. And we have here images of private university with huge new science center, which is like just a gorgeous building. And just below is the brand new Portland Museum of Art renderings that we have only just begun. This landmark structure in Portland will be really an amazing wood-based high performance building. I'm assuming that's going to go for Passive House, knowing the people that are involved in that. And then just last night, Passive House Maine hosted a tour in the buildings here on the right, which are University of Southern Maine's new dormitories, 220,000 square feet of dormitory, and a new student center with mass timber. So even, you know, Portland cities are quite small, but there is a contrast in the sort of embracing of high performance, low carbon, low energy construction, and our rural counterparts. And Maine is predominantly rural. So I'm just mindful of the time. I kind of went kind of quickly through, but if I don't know, if I wanted to add anything more to this, I would say that I'm optimistic about Mainers embracing that self-sufficiency that's inherent in a sturdy building, and the trainings, the new materials that we have lend themselves to that. The way that Retrofit Maine is working to help, it still feels like in some ways we've been stuck with funding, and pandemic has been a hindrance. But right now there is huge momentum to move forward with retrofits. Passive House Maine and Retrofit Maine represent a better than weatherization model. That's our position. That was always been our position as Passive House Maine, with the new code saying, okay, it's not just new, but low energy, Passive House standard. And with the retrofits, we're saying the same, not just weatherization. Let's go further, make these buildings more resilient and more robust in extreme weather. I didn't say, but Maine is a leader in the adoption of heat pump technology. As I said, we have a ducted heat pump in our house. Many people in Maine have heat pumps. They've been well incentivized for almost 10 years. So it's like half of the formula, though. The heat pumps are installed into buildings that are not with very little attention to the envelope. Another challenge for Maine's buildings include the single most common building typology in Maine of all the types, let's say like capes or those triple deckers. the most common is a mobile home, 60,000 of them in Maine, and they're a bit of a disaster. So there's work in that regard too being done. Retrofitting those has proven to be not helpful. I think I'll leave it there and open up. I have, I can absolutely answer questions about what Retrofit Maine is doing and how Passive House Maine sees that program working. And
Let me jump in.
Yeah,
Let me
go ahead.
jump in, Naomi. Thank you very
Sure.
much. That was actually really, really interesting presentation you gave. And I had some questions in mind, but then you provoked a bunch of others, if I can
Yeah.
take some liberties with them.
Of course.
When you look at all the work that you've been doing, what would you say is the most common retrofit that you do? I don't know if there's I know it's envelope based, but what specific things do people want to take up most quickly?
Well, the things that people want to do, I think, there's a lot of let's replace the windows. And then you're like, well, hang on there, cowboy. Let's take a look at your basement. And there's a lot of rubble basements in older buildings. Rubble is kind of a rough word for a stone, like a stone basement. And how do you insulate and air seal and water seal basements to eliminate humidity seepage into the living space. So yeah, that's always a big one. And insulating the attic. Those are the two. That's where you go first. That's where you point people, despite their instincts, for new.
And I imagine money plays a role in that. So sometimes the right thing to do costs a heck of a lot of money. Does that change the balance of what they focus on?
Well, I mean, for instance, with those windows, the cheap version of that is a plastic insert. That's what usually gets done for windows. Or air sealing, somebody walking around with a caulk gun, that doesn't cost very much money. It's not very long lasting. So there are compromises, there are places, that's where you meet the difference between weatherization approaches, which are highly subsidized. Actually, in Maine, we have pretty decent programs for that very basic level of weatherization. We have less generous for those larger projects, and cost is always a challenge.
Yeah. You mentioned that electrification was an important way to go. And that strikes me because I think electrification works at the house, but that electricity's got to come from somewhere. And it also has lots of grid issues. If Maine's kind of like the dispersed rural structure that you've got, wouldn't electrification bring its own big problems?
Oh, Scott, as if you work with the opposition. Well, so first of all, Maine's grid is actually really clean, relatively. So we have that as a sort of backdrop. So when we lean into the grid, that's not the worst thing. And actually, part and parcel with our Retrofit Maine concept is that the enhancing the efficiency of all of these buildings that are dispersed across the grid then would reduce, grid load and try to ease that. But the word on the street is, in Maine, we have about 10 years worth of grid increases, full electrification, before we run into problems, before we need to expand and modernize. So people are working on that modernization in Maine currently. Okay. But we have, at our house, we tightened up a bunch of things, made them more efficient, added a bunch of solar panels on, and kind of try to balance out our actual load based on and electrification. Yeah.
Just to defend myself from being on the dark side of the equation, it's actually not all grid-based electricity. There can be distributed generation models, and I'm sure that would play an important role. If you get the demand side down because you've done the passive approach and you have local generation, that might not be a grid-based solution.
Right. I mean, there's not much of that right now, other than on universities and some islands in terms of, sort of a smaller subgrid, sub-generation, local generation. Mostly we're connected to Canada,
Oh, there you go. That's where I am.
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of other questions, but I would like to invite, if any of the other participants have got questions, if you could raise your hands, if you've got a question, I would certainly call on you as a preference. There's a question I had for you, Naomi, and this is one I've asked both of Tomas and of Richard. It's interesting to me to find out, how do you measure impact? How do you know that your activities are having a lasting effect on your clients, your professional communities who are out there working? They're distributed. You go out to meet them, you talk to them in the woods, etc. How can you confirm that you're having an enduring impact on the methods and the techniques that they're applying?
Well, right now, our only metric is that people keep on coming back to the trainings, coming back to the events. We don't have great data on actual buildings to prove that, but the interest in the professional level, at this point, I want to believe is being translated into actual impact on buildings. Measuring that's still a work in progress.
So that led to another question. I think you've just answered it. Are you able to see an improvement over time in the population of buildings in Maine? And it sounds like it might be early days to be able to do that.
Especially, I mean, definitely in the new build, for sure. But there's some. We have a lot of weatherized buildings. I mean, the problem is at the state, they're measuring weather like through the weatherization program and celebrating a lot about the expansion of weatherization. And absolutely, we're in all hands on deck mode right now, so I don't want to discount that. But the number of fully electrified, ventilated projects in Maine are not very many. They're not very many. We're working on it.
All right. I see your prize giver has got no. That's InShow's prize giver, but the Ken Levinson's got his hand up, so I'd like to invite him to come in with a question. Ken, you're muted.
Thank you, Scott. Great presentation, Naomi. I was actually a perfect segue because my question was related to the state's engagement, and I had the pleasure of attending your winter forum up in Maine, in your hometown, which was wonderful. And I was impressed by the state and the representatives' engagement there and their literacy of many of the issues. And so I was curious where that conversation is, because with the expense comes the funding, and where the state's going to bring that, and the competition with weatherization, which is unfortunate, but perhaps unavoidable. So
right.
Wondering if your thoughts on all that.
Well, we have been really grateful to have received significant funding for the training program. And I think that's where they're going right now. Like, let's get people who are well educated in building science principles and in approaches to existing buildings that are better than weatherization. And I think that this focus on bringing people into the fold, across the state, not just in Portland or not just in wealthy southern coastal Maine, is, they're supporting us in that. And otherwise, as you mentioned, we had representatives from the governor's office presenting at our forum. They're very aware of looking through the equity lens and not leaving people behind. And their focus is, I'm so grateful that our governor has provided leadership in making this climate transition without leaving people behind through the equity lens, making sure that not only fancy people get their houses updated. Go ahead.
Right. Well, yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, it does seem like, I don't know, from distance that the heat pump initiative really was like a very targeted way to do that, perhaps, like where you can get heat pumps into houses pretty much anywhere at any income level with a relatively small investment up front anyway. And I don't know, I guess the trick is, how do we then actually move to the infrastructure of the building?
Right. I mean, and a lot of it comes down to cost, but even before that, a lot of it comes down to workforce and who do we get to actually do that work.
But won't the workforce follow?
I mean, that's a tough chicken and egg thing. Remember the early days of Passive House? Like, oh yeah, we want all the buildings built to Passive House. Oh yeah, who's going to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just opine that what we saw in New York when it started out were people, owners, and what the intent on doing Passive House and bringing the workers along.
Right.
And I think that it's backwards, honestly, to say that we need to train the workers first. What we need is the demand, and the contractors will figure it out.
If I can come in with a complicated question for probably both of you, if you don't mind. Looking at Maine, I've heard it said that it's a relatively older population, so that's one dimension. You've got communities who had their lifestyles undercut. You pointed out that town with a mill that then shut down and suddenly it lost their population. Somebody can be very intelligent and know exactly how things should be done. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to pay for all of the investment, the capital, the workforce, etc. And if it's all going to be done through grant funding, that's going to be a very long and slow process. And yet mobilizing finance for retrofit seems to be an essential part of any kind of a transition. And we're talking about transitions that have happened in the past in Maine, but there are transitions coming down the pipe all over the planet. So if we could figure out how to solve that issue, that would seem to be an important point. Any thoughts on that?
I at our forum, we did have a couple of our, capitalist buddies who are trying to figure out, some programs that will actually make money while doing appropriate retrofits. I don't know how successful they're being, but I hope they are. I hope they're able to make money and not leave residents in the lurch. I have a vision which I'd love to share with this group and see if this resonates for anybody and for a reality. And that is there a scheme in which we can sell carbon credits for insulating buildings? Like, they're literally packing embodied carbon onto buildings, depending on how you're doing it, and you're saving, it's sort of twofold. You're both saving carbon emissions, potential emissions with extra load, and then you're also literally stapling, wood chips onto houses. Anybody here have any insight into that concept?
I think the the concept of embedded carbon is a bit risky because often they refer to embedded carbon as the CO2 emissions that occurred while producing and delivering products to the house. You're using it in a slightly different way, which is actually carbon storage. And I'm storing carbon in this house with wood chip based insulation, and there should be some credit gained for that. Philosophically, I completely agree with what you're proposing. I would even go farther than that and say that one of the challenges for retrofit, when I'm looking at my spreadsheet and trying to justify the expenditure, I need to look at not only the energy savings and eventually your carbon storage benefits, but also the health savings and the other social benefits that we're getting. The challenge is, how can we identify those revenue streams and bring them back to the person who's funding that project? So I completely philosophically agree. I don't know if anybody else would like to come in on that.
We've got one project where some people are working on a way to standardize improvements in building performance and turn that into a basis for credits that would parallel, it would be that could be traded. So it would be a parallel marketplace to carbon credits, I think. I don't have the stuff in the front of my mind right now, although there was a time when I knew it quite well. But the idea is that there are carbon, correct me, I'm going to screw this up, so you have to fix it when I'm done making a hash of it. But there are today carbon credits that are traded. And what these guys want to do is create a standardized way of measuring the improved energy efficiency in the building so that there can be a parallel energy efficiency credit. Now, that doesn't give you a credit for stored carbon, although one could imagine one could build that in to the calculation. That doesn't seem like it'd be an impossible thing to do. But at least I know people who are working on the energy efficiency credits.
I mean, carbon credits seem very murky to me. I don't know, it seems like a very kind of a sketchy business, but if some people are doing it, I'm just curious about, you know.
Well, the argument, somebody's going to know this better than me, but I think the argument goes something like it facilitates. The argument against it is it's a way of buying greenwash, right? I don't actually make any improvements, so somebody else did, and I get credit for what they did, or some such thing as that. On the other hand, if that helps the initial do-gooder do the good, because they get credits and can sell them off that way, right, and they can keep being sold until somebody holds on to them and claims them, and then they're retired. But then that helps the initial person finance what they do. Then it's a pump primer in the marketplace.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would agree. I would say the credits are another tool, and it's all depends on how the market is set up. You know, it could be super helpful or meaningless.
Right. I mean, also, I don't know, like how much carbon is really stored in some insulation on a single family home. Is that worth about $31.50 and not really?
But you need to be able to bundle it, right? So that
right.
Big institutions like the pension funds and whoever is doing the carbon accounting for the ESGs and everything need to be able to bundle massive amounts of buildings.
I think this is something absolutely that is worth pursuing, and it is a good idea. And I think there are mechanisms for doing it. We just simply need to make sure that we have that well understood by everybody. I would like to, there's one final item from my end, and it's something that Michael Bennett has been pushing for, which is best practices on rural retrofits. And Naomi, I think you're a natural leader for that activity. Michael wasn't so much focused on rural retrofits, but retrofit best practice guidance. His concern was that if you come in and do kind of a not necessarily thought through sequencing, you can actually damage the full benefit potential if you haven't done it the right way.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that this community would be the perfect community to come up with some sort of best practices so that how you go about doing retrofits, whether it's urban or rural, people could understand the consequences of doing this versus that versus something else in a priority way.
The problem is that the decision-making tree, is different depending on the project. And we are working on that too as part of the Retrofit Maine website and data collection. Like what are the questions you should ask and where do they take you, rather than saying start with a basement, that may or may not be the right way. And in any given scenario. So I'm so excited to work on that with anybody and everybody.
That would be great. I'm gonna probably draw my Q&A to a close and hand it back to Barbara Ann. I would like to thank you, Naomi, for two reasons. One is that was a nice presentation, but even better, you put some very thought-provoking ideas on the table, and it's going to make us go back and scratch our heads. And that's what the value for me of these webinars is, getting people to think about different approaches and different possibilities. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back to Barbara Ann.
Thanks so much, Scott. Good luck.
Thank you both, Naomi and Scott. Naomi, that was very, very informative, and I suppose it's so relevant to what we're doing here in Ireland. I was really riveted. So thank you so much, and to thank Scott. Scott's rushing off to do a keynote at the Passive House conference in Canada now at 12 noon over there. So we're conscious that he's going to be getting out of Dodge and moving on. And he'll talk to us again. He'll talk to us again at our next webinar, which brings me to the point that our next webinar for BAC Learning will be on Wednesday, the 14th of June at the same time. And Best in Scotland have asked if they can do that one, and we're delighted to be able to facilitate them. So I also want to remind you all that I sent you a save the date on Monday for our ministerial symposium, which will take place in person in Enniscorthy on the 27th and 28th of June. We hope to see as many representatives of our hubs attend, if at all possible. It would be great to see people in person. It's, we saw some people in Pittsburgh, but it'd be really good to have you here in Enniscorthy. And I will share more about that with you all in the coming days. But thank you all so much for attending today, and thank Naomi again. As I said, this is being recorded, and we will share it on our website. So make sure there aren't any more questions gone in there into the chat, just to be sure. There are people who are all having to run. We all have a busy Wednesday. But thank you, Naomi. You've made it a very interesting afternoon. We really do appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me and listening to Rural Retrofits in Maine. It's a big challenge.
Thank you all very much, and we'll be talking to you soon, and we hope to see you on the 14th of June, and hopefully maybe the end of June here in Enniscorthy. See you all again. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stop record. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And let's start downloading.